Welcome to Catholic in America, the show that engages people at the intersection between faith and culture. I'm your host, Father Michael Nixon. I'm joined, as always, by my co-hosts, Father Doug Martin and Father Tom Dillon.
Today, we're looking at whether or not priests should be married, and would that solve some of the issues in our church?
Our main talking points today are going to include, will allowing priests to be married, is that going to solve the problem of pedophilia in the church? Will that also solve the problem of the priest shortage? And what's up with celibacy?
And today we've been infiltrated by an actual married priest, Father Doug Martin. So sparks are going to fly. Stay tuned. All right, thanks for joining us here on Catholic in America. Again, today we're talking about whether or not Catholic priests should get married.
And please share and subscribe.
So with that, I know you guys have probably heard a lot of points that people made, objections, basically why people think celibacy for Catholic priests is crazy. We have one married Catholic priest with us on the show today, Father Doug. So what are some of the reasons that we've heard?
Well, some of them that I've heard has been, a shortage in the priesthood, that we don't have enough guys that are there. Loneliness, that our priests are lonely and they need companionship, and they're not having that in their priesthood. And then, also I've been told, Peter was married, so why not do it? I mean, why wouldn't that be a good idea?
It's the biblical trump card that people are throwing down. Peter was married. What about that?
Yeah. That's it. Proof it's a good idea.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and also some of the other questions that I've heard is that as celibacy is kind of an odd thing, especially in the world that we live in today, are we attracting the wrong type of people? And what's up with celibacy? Is celibacy a good thing in the modern world, especially with the different scandals that have affected the church in the last 30, 40, 50 years? And so, is this actually attracting the wrong type of people? And what is this? Is this actually helpful anymore?
I think something that comes up a lot, particularly where we live, there's a lot of people in Protestant denominations and where their pastors are married. So my pastor's married, why shouldn't priests get married? People come up with all sorts of things. I heard it wasn't a rule in the church until the 16th century or something, which we can get into the history of that. That's not exactly true, but just a lot of those objections that come up a lot, and probably people have heard them. And I think some of it, maybe we can think about what's people's reasons for that, not just reasons that they put out in front of them, but what are people experiencing when they see the celibate priesthood or see a married priest in a mostly celibate priesthood. For you, Father Doug, what are their reasons why they might have a problem with that, or they might struggle with that in talking to a priest, or maybe even leaving the church?
Yeah, one of the things that I got when I was first ordained, and even before I was ordained, is that it was going to be easier to talk to me because I'm married, because I can relate to them if I'm married. And, that was a very common objection. I was told that, I'd rather go to you for confession rather than celibate priest, because you're going to be able to speak into my life. I got told that quite a bit. And then also the ability to be able to relate to their children as well, that because I'm married and I'm a father, that I'd be able to relate to their kids, and I'd be able to relate to their whole family and the family dynamic.
I feel that sometimes there's people with maybe good intentions that love the priesthood and want to relate better to the priest, that might be a reason. There's also people that have kind of their own intentions. They want to change the priesthood or change the church, and that is kind of a challenge to them as well. So we have kind of both of those factors at work, where people are struggling with the priesthood or they object to the celibate priesthood, not because they want to just relate better, which I think is a great reason, but because it challenges them, or maybe it brings up some of their own places where they disagree or they have problems with the church.
Yeah, I think that also within the priesthood, obviously, we've seen a lot of priests, even in our ministry, we've seen priests walk away from the priesthood for the sake of relationship and companionship. And so, in that call, which is even going back to Genesis, going back to Scripture, you'll find that God says it's not good for man to be alone. And then in this fundamental longing of the human heart, and especially the masculine heart, for femininity, how does that play out in the priesthood? Where do you find companionship? Where do you find intimacy in the priesthood? And I think that on the outside, as people are looking at the priesthood on the outside, they're just well, that's obviously a very lonely life. And I think that in honesty, a lot of priests do struggle with loneliness. So I think that that's a piece of it, but I also think that there sometimes is a misperception, because I've talked to a lot of married men who are also very lonely. Mm-hmm. But then, how do you find intimacy in the priesthood? How do you find that in the context of celibacy and all that goes into that? Because we have seen lots of guys, even brother priests, who've walked away for that very reason.
to me too, we're in a culture and a society, and we need to recognize the culture that we're in that's impacted by the sexual revolution, where basically we're told on a daily basis that we can't live without sex, and that we're defined not just by our gender, but by our sexual activity. That sexual activity now defines us. So to say someone that would willfully decide not to engage in sexual activity automatically becomes this sort of incomprehensible struggle for people. In a sense, it's kind of, it's otherworldly. And to me, it's always that celibacy is pointing towards something beyond itself. But yeah, just that struggle that people have because we're wounded by the culture that we're in, but we're part of the culture as well. So when someone's living in a way that's contrary to it, that becomes a challenge.
I've been told that there's a connection between, I've heard this, there's a connection between sexual abuse and celibacy, that men are more drawn to that because they're single and they're looking for that companionship. And so it kind of shows itself in inordinate ways and in ways that aren't natural necessarily and abusive even. And so they it's almost as if, well, they just can't contain themselves because they're celibate and they've promised not to do this, but there's such a strong urge that they've got to do it. And so it shows itself in the form of abuse. And
definitely something that we're a lot more aware of now as a society, something that's at the forefront of everyone's minds. But even what you brought up, Father Tom, that this, what is the type of men that are being attracted to the priesthood? If celibacy is the normal rule for the priesthood, is it bringing up those? Are those kind of men being attracted to it?
As well as the perception that, okay, if guys are allowed to get married, then that's going to kind of satisfy that natural urge and that natural passion that God has given to man, and therefore, if we had married priests, all of a sudden this problem of pedophilia or of sexual abuse in general, it would magically disappear, which I think is a perception. I'm not sure it's real. It's actual, it's rooted in truth, but there is that perception that this is going to solve this problem, which I think is the problem is obviously a lot deeper than just that. And so putting a Band-Aid on it is that, but that's how I think the perception is that if we allow guys to get married, then all of a sudden this is no longer going to be an issue.
Yeah, okay. And again, bringing up why people are feeling this way, I think people are hurt by the church. People have been hurt by sexual abuse at every level of society, within families and different organizations, but in particular in the church, because men that have been entrusted with authority, with spiritual authority, and for the care of souls would abuse that authority, that hurt runs deep. And in a sense, looking for a way to fix this, that obviously it's monstrous when somebody would abuse somebody and abuse their authority in that way, sexually or otherwise. So just looking for a way that people are looking for answers in a sense. They're looking for some sort of accountability. And this seems to be kind of what's the big difference in the Catholic Church, and it is celibacy. So it's the easy thing to look at. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and even, they also look at maybe the Eastern churches as well. We don't look at that as much here because we don't have them around as much. They're not very apparent. But the people who are aware of Eastern Catholics and come to the realization and know that some of their guys are married, that the rule there is a little different than in the Latin Rite, they assume that there's no issues over in the Eastern Catholic churches either. There's no sex abuse, there's no loneliness, that marriage solves all the problems, and that there's no problems that happen once you're married. And I think that can be a little short-sighted too, but again, it goes to a deeper issue of dealing with, well, this is our problem, and so how do we fix our problem? Well, we go to someone else's solution, not realizing there's problems there too.
Yeah, and so recognizing that there's a systemic problem in these areas, and it has a lot to do with our approach to sex, has a lot to do with our approach to intimacy and relationships, and that celibacy, again, within the Catholic Church as priests, is this very difficult thing to grapple with. So before we get into the next part of our show where we talk about where the Catholic faith and these topics of culture intersect, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. back to Catholic in America. We're discussing today whether or not Catholic priests should get married.
If you appreciate what you see, please like, share, subscribe.
And if you'd like to support us, please support us on Patreon.
So we've discussed all the reasons people are against celibacy, why people think it's a bad idea within our culture and society and even within the church. So what are the reasons for it? Why does the church maintain this rule? We have exceptions with Father Doug being a married Catholic priest, but why are some of the reasons and why does this make sense in the light of our faith?
I think that you have to look at some of the false assumptions first in order to answer whether or not having married clerics on a more massive level. Obviously, we do have married clerics. We have married priests. We have our spy right now.
We have married deacons as well.
Absolutely, we have married deacons. Sure, yeah. And I think that historically, for the first 1,000 years of the church, we did have married clerics. And if you go back to the historical records and you go back to the reasons for why celibacy became mandated as a discipline throughout the whole church, the reason for it was because of the problems that happened in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. That obviously now we're 1,000 years later, and that's what people who are ignorant of history, I think that's also why I like that phrase, ignorance of history means you're going to be doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. But when you had the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, there's also this false understanding that celibacy all of a sudden was a creation of the Council of Trent.
Which is 16th century.
16th, so, which was a response to Luther. Well, Luther wanted to, actually, one of Luther's main points was that he wanted to go out and get married. And so he left the church, as that was at least one of his points, because actually at that point, celibacy was a discipline within the church. And that became a major point in the 10th century, which Pope Gregory VII, who was the Pope at the time, had been dealing with all these problems. And all the past popes for the last 200 years prior to that had been dealing with all these problems of married clerics. And that's when, in the 10th century, dealing with the problems that he was dealing with at that time was simony, which was the buying and selling of church offices, as well as a lot of, and I'm not saying that, Doug, you'd ever do this.
But so far I haven't been offered enough.
That's good. But as you know, as a married priest, and you have kids, you want to make sure that you take care of your kids, especially when you die. Absolutely. So what had happened in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries is you had tons of married priests, and as we know, many people are very generous with the church. And so they give endowments, they give all these funds, they buy vessels. And so in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, you had these priests who were receiving gifts for the church, but then you had, not only did you have the buying and selling of church offices.
He was giving it to Junior.
Yeah, exactly. He was giving it to Junior.
And he was
chalice. Then you had bishops who were just well, I'm going to make sure that my son's going to be taken care of, and he's going to be a bishop after me, and I'm going to give my diocese to him, and I'm going to give this parish to him. And this chalice,
which happens in politics now. But it used to happen.
Oh my gosh, let's not talk about that. No, but so that's why Gregory VII, looking at all these different problems, as well as they've been dealing with these problems for a long time, and the selling of church offices, the stealing of the property of the church, and all this happened. It was not, for the most part, a problem which was happening with the celibates. It was a problem which was happening with married clerics, and that's where the discipline came into. And so I think that understanding the historical reality of why celibacy became mandated as a general norm in the church, because if we had married clerics, as we know, people think that magically we're not going to have any problems anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that we might just have different types of problems.
And it brings up too, because I think obviously celibacy within the church as a discipline and practice and a norm for a lot of people within the church, monks and nuns and people that, vowed to life of virginity, that's been there from the beginning. That Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, talks about some that have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And that there's always that call. St. Paul talks about this as well.
John the Apostle.
John the Apostle. That Peter, even though he was married, and we know that because Jesus heals his mother-in-law.
Right.
No jokes there,
yeah.
Doug.
But never said Peter asked for his mother-in-law. Just that he informed her.
That's right.
That's correct. Yeah. He wasn't necessarily asking. That's
right. So that's always been there. But then there's always been this, in order to follow Jesus in a really particular way, because Jesus was not married. Jesus lived his whole life in not married according to the earthly sense. He lays down his life for his bride, which is the church.
You do have the conspiracy theories that say that.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary Magdalene.
But in the sense that Jesus is married, to the church, that he lays down his life for his bride. And so even within celibacy, instead of just a renouncing of something, as in like marriage is bad and we don't want that, or does he take care of land regulations in the 10th century, that I'm saying yes to something. And I think that's maybe what people miss a lot of times, is that it's not primarily a no, but it is a yes, because I want to more closely resemble and live my life in union with Christ. And as a priest within celibacy, I get to do that in a particular way. It's challenging, obviously, and it is sacrificial, but it's beautiful when it's lived well.
Yeah, and I think, as a married priest, that's something that I've recognized when I look back at the biblical record, and I look in those early centuries, and even today when I'm looking at my brother priests and I'm looking at the ways that you guys get to interact that I can't. I have a limitation, and that's part of the reason why the married priesthood isn't maybe seen as necessarily a good idea, is because of the limitation that happens. And so you look at the early church and you think about, Thomas and all the apostles that went all over the world and were able to evangelize without fear, because they didn't think that their wife or their children was going to be affected by it. They weren't going to be killed and martyred. It was just them. And that's all that they really had to pay attention to for themselves, was the flock, the people that they were in front of. And so, I think that the type of sacrifice that our brothers priests have to make, that you guys have to make as being celibate, is a sacrifice that if we lost that, the effect on the church, the effect on our faithful would be a huge, huge issue. And we might not be able to recognize it until too many years later to realize, man, have we made a mistake with this? And so I think the idea that this is going to solve something, that this is going to solve an issue, well, it may solve one problem, and I'm not sure if it's going to solve some of the problems that we're thinking it's going to solve, but the issues that are created after that. Because, my question would be, when you get to this, and this has happened with priests who are married, who are coming in like me as a former Anglican, and Eastern priests coming in as well. One of the problems that's happened is divorce.
So he was an Anglican priest, everyone, just to let you know. Yeah. Father Doug converted, became Catholic, and years later became a Catholic priest. He didn't sneak in. We weren't unaware of you, like, pull one over on the bishop or anything like that.
Got introduced for it. So that's right. But there's several guys that's come in like me that have divorced. And that's one issue that you don't really consider when you're thinking about married priests. You're assuming that the priests that you're getting are going to be, I guess, perfect is what you would think. And so you think,
the subsequent scandal that happens with
what happens
broken families,
and the
with
strain
priests,
on a marriage,
absolutely.
Even before that can be there too.
Strain on the marriage,
which isn't the only reason, or to say carte blanche, that's a bad thing, but it does bring up other struggles as well. One of the things I thought about too is what celibacy is as a sign, like celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, that it is this in a sense, in the world, that we're priests who live in the world. We interact with, we're out in a monastery somewhere, we're in our parishes, that a sign, imperfect and as sinful as we are, that this world is not all there is. That we're pointing beyond this world towards, that celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, that we're made for heaven, and that marriages are supposed to be a sign of that too in their own distinct way. But this celibacy, in a sense, beginning to live now here on earth, what we're going to be entering into in heaven, which is union with God and union with the whole body of Christ, the whole church. So the more that we're living that, it's a countercultural sign. I recognize that. No one runs up to me and says, like, you shouldn't have to be obedient to your bishop. No one ever seems to struggle with that, or you shouldn't have to pray the liturgy of the hours 5 times a day.
Right.
No one seems to have a problem with me praying or having a simple life or being obedient to my bishop. But celibacy is the one that's a challenge to them, because it in a sense kind of awakens them possibly to the fact that there might be more than just this world. And that's what our faith is about.
Well, but I do think that, in fairness to the argument, that a lot of people do perceive loneliness.
Yeah.
Like this thing of loneliness. Because as a visible sign, that's what Pope Benedict talked about quite a bit, as well as John Paul II. And Pope Francis has made allusions to it as well, as Pope Francis says he is not going to carte blanche just allow married clerics because of the importance of celibacy as both a tradition. But I think that many people who are looking at this problem of celibacy are looking at the problem from, what about the loneliness? And what about all these effects that seem to be flowing from celibacy, such as guys who are leaving the priesthood, and people who love and they fall in love with their priest in a good and healthy way, but then they see their priests are lonely and struggling. They leave and they're like, well, this seems to be a consequence of celibacy. I think that looking at that a little bit more deeply is important, is that recognizing, and that's what I remember being in a seminary, or in pre-seminary, and I was talking to my spiritual director at one point, and I asked him about, I was like, aren't you lonely as a priest? And what he actually told me, he was like, not really. He's like, I'm so busy. Like, I don't have time to be, I don't have time to be lonely, which I think we can probably all relate to that, at least me and you, Mike, being celibate. It's like, because we do have the freedom to engage and to give ourselves and empty ourselves out entirely into our ministry. But obviously you go home at night and you don't have someone to cling to. You don't have someone to cleave to, at least not in that physical sense. You do have the spiritual relationship with our Lord and the intimacy which we find in our ministry, because like as a married man, we are called to empty ourselves out onto the bride, onto the church. And that's where we find that in that intimacy of pouring ourselves out in our ministry, that we find that fecundity, we find that life, that we find the Holy Spirit present there. But in that physical way in which we come home at night, obviously we don't have someone to cling to. We don't have someone. But that's what my spiritual director at the time told me, which actually gave me a different perspective on looking at celibacy. Is that he's like, Tom, he's like, don't think that loneliness is going to be solved by getting married. He's like, because I know many married men who've been married for 20, 30 years who are lying, and he's like, you can be lying next to someone in bed at night and still feel lonely.
Well, I mean, you have emptiness syndrome that comes with that. I mean, when the kids get out of the house, you have this couple that come together, and after 30 years being together, they split up and they go, I don't know them, because their whole life was wrapped around those children. When they get out, I mean, I've talked to couples who've had this where they're like, I'm just trying to get to know him again, and just trying to figure out who this person is I've been married to for 30 years, that we've had kids involved, and now the kids are gone and we have to be together. I don't know him as well anymore.
Even within a good marriage, not necessarily just like a marriage on the rocks that I feel lonely, but even within the best marriage, the best circumstance, best friend group, that you can still experience loneliness. And I think maybe we're just not used to being okay with that. Not okay as in like I just accept the loneliness, but okay in recognizing that this is I'm gonna have to suffer through this, and that God is present there, and can I experience God there? And I think, that's maybe the hopeful aspect when we talk about the priesthood. It's not just a sociological thing that we at this order of ordained people, and then they don't have marriage. That this is something supernatural, that we have a relationship with God, that in our loneliness are we learning how to pray. And I think hopefully that's a sign for other people too, in the midst of their own relationships, in the midst of, they might be in a great marriage and all of a sudden their spouse dies.
Yeah.
And the loneliness that can enter in there, or when there's an illness or where there's a separation, like how do you encounter God there? And hopefully as celibate clergy, we're helping people to see that and to experience that it's possible.
But back to your point about celibacy pointing to something that's heavenly, something that's true in reality, is that, do the folks who want a married priesthood, are they thinking about the reality of that, of what that priesthood is pointing to? And then also, that their marriage isn't permanent. I mean, it's just still death. I mean, that's the contract. We're only going to stay, this is going to happen till death. And then when we go to heaven, we're not going to be married. We're not going to have that intimacy. I mean, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but that intimacy is going to be with God. It's going to be with our Lord, as opposed to necessarily with another that we're married to. And so the reality that it's pointing to, maybe for people is struggling with that reality as well. We know that people are struggling with their relationship with God, even at the moment, that they pray and they don't know if anyone's listening, and those sorts of things. And that's where maybe some of the fear comes from, is I need someone. And so obviously they need someone, because I'm not hearing God as well. Maybe they're not hearing God as well either. But to realize for a priest and for or even a religious, that their marriage to a certain extent is to that bride. And so that's when, anytime someone tells me that a priest doesn't understand me because they're all not married, I'm like, no, they have many wives and husbands right here in the church. They understand very well.
We have many wives and husbands, is what we're trying to say. Well, I always think about this when I was getting ready to get ordained a priest. I had the great joy, Ty, who's my younger brother, Titus, who's an awesome guy, awesome man of God, and he was getting ready to get married to his amazing bride, Colleen. And I was very blessed to witness their marriage. It's my first marriage that I was a celebrant for after I was ordained priest. My baby sister's getting married pretty soon, so I'm going to do her wedding soon. But as we're getting ready for that, I'm going towards priesthood. Ty's getting ready to get married. In a sense, I recognize that this call is similar. It's to give everything to this person and to die for them. And he's called to lay down his life for his bride. But I always laugh like when people would come up to me as a seminarian studying to be a priest and say like, "Oh, thank you so much for your sacrifice. Thank you for your sacrifice." And again, there's sacrifice involved, including the sacrifice of not getting married. But no one at any point went up to Ty as he's getting ready to get married to Colleen and said, "Ty,
thank you for your sacrifice.
Thank you for your sacrifice.
Thank you for taking Colleen."
We know if you wouldn't have done it, no one would have or something. And now Colleen is way out of Ty's league. And recognizing that there is huge sacrifices within marriage, but it's not some sort of like, I'm just going to grit my teeth and bear it in order to do this. You do it out of love. And I think that's maybe the part that people can't see. And maybe in our own life as priests, we don't do a good enough job of living or expressing or talking about. Is I do this out of a responsive love, that I've experienced the love of God for me, and that he's invited me to follow him in this particular way as a priest and as a celibate, and that it's joyful because I'm doing it out of love, not because the Pope has told me that I have to do this.
Yeah, if I can interject, I think that also going back to like the notion of family, and I don't think that we really talk about this because it's also one of the things that people don't want to necessarily talk about, but the consequence upon the priesthood and on priests of the diminishment, the smaller nuclear family. So as people have had less children, and as families have shrunk dramatically over the last 50 years. But like for me, I come from a family where I have, like you, quite a few siblings, but I have 6 sisters, I have a brother. And I think that for me, like my relationships with my sisters as a celibate is super important, as well as like my brother. But like at this point, I have 19 nieces and nephews. And so for me, like it's beautiful because like for me, when I want to get away from the parish, when I want to go and have that family experience, I go and I seek out my relationship with my siblings. I have kids around them. And that's also where I recognize, oh my gosh, like marriage is not is not like the illusion of what I had cracked up in my like 18-year-old brain when I was like, oh, marriage is going to solve all the problems in the world. I was like, I see like the reality of the difficulty of marriage, but at the same time, like coming from a big family and having lots of siblings as well as nephews and nieces that I can go and I can find this like fecundity and within my own heart, I can find this relationship there. And it awakens me to the reality of what marriage is, but also it sharpens my own understanding of my celibate call. But in society, I know like a lot of my brother priests who are only child, or they have one sibling who now lives on the opposite side of the country and they don't have family. Like there is, I think that is a big problem.
Yeah.
And
It's funny, you describe yourself basically as a grandparent. You get to come in, get the kids all riled up and leave,
Right, beloved uncle.
That's right. The uncle.
What my sisters always call me.
Yeah, you get to come in and get them all riled up, give them the candy and sugar and all that, and then they're like, "Oh, they're your problem now." So, yeah, and I think that happens sometimes in the church too. We have people that come in and rile them all up, and then we're the dad that's got to kind of come in and solve some of those issues. And
I would say too, with that my life as a priest, I've been a pastor now for several years, which is a tremendous grace. And I've been a priest now for going on 11 years, which is crazy. That God is so good that He's called me to this. That when I'm stepping into when I'm not like running from it, running from suffering and running from loneliness, or when I'm stepping into loving people as a celibate priest in the way that God has called me, it's so challenging because it's calling me to be a husband, to the church, to be a father, to be a brother and a confidant, and all those sorts of things. And it's also inviting me to that I needed to become a man of deep prayer. I need to be someone of generosity, that the temptation towards selfishness and loneliness and turning in on myself, that's there for me, but it's there for all of us. So in a sense, the more that I'm fighting against that, the happier that I'm going to be ultimately.
I think it's amazing that when you look at the theology of marriage and some of the stuff that's really been put out over the last several years now, good it is in talking about marriage is really these two people trying to make sure the other one gets to heaven. That really is the focus of each spouse. That's the same thing that the priest is doing for the congregation, for the bride of Christ itself. We're trying to make sure that the bride, that the people that we're responsible for, the people that we love and we come to know, are going to they're going to make it heaven. That we're going to be a part of that. That we're going to be able to love them into that and to see ourselves that way. I think sometimes some of the issue that happens is maybe you have priests that aren't seeing it that way, or maybe they've forgotten it and they don't get it. And so people see that and they're like, man, I'd rather have this guy over here because he's a loving father and he's good to his kids and all that kind of stuff. And so they see that father. And I think some of the hunger that you see for married priesthood comes from priests not being dads enough, not being fathers enough, being more administrators, being more, the principal, the fuddy-dud, the one who's telling everybody they got to do it this way or else, no, you didn't genuflect far enough down, whatever it may be, and not seeing their role as dad and as father and loving their people as if they are.
And especially in a world where like even the definition of father is now under attack, is trying to be redefined or totally mitigated and say that this is no longer a thing. Fatherhood, motherhood is a social construct and doesn't exist. And teleologically, it doesn't exist in reality. It's just some social thing. But which gets to the very heart of who we are as human beings. But I think that also what we have done a poor job in, and like I think that we have done a poor job, is one, teaching the people of God, teaching the laity, teaching people what celibacy is.
Yeah.
As well as when we were in seminary, and this also depends upon the seminary that you went to, we were taught what celibacy was. And that's why I remember being in seminary, it might have been pre-seminary when I was at Steubenville, University of Steubenville. But I remember being taught by, I don't remember exactly who it was, but what was told me is like, if you're not called to marriage, if you don't feel a call to marriage, if you don't feel a call to fatherhood, if you don't feel a call to be a husband, please leave now. Because the same qualities that make you a good husband and the same qualities that make you a good spouse, like you can't flee into the priesthood to avoid women.
Right.
It's also,
Yeah.
interestingly, most of our ministry, at least 80% of our ministry is done with females and is done with women because women come to the church much more so than men. Yeah. So what we were told though in seminary is like, you can't flee into the priesthood. And so like there's this perception in society that people, the men, kind of these odd men or these guys who are on the internet.
I couldn't get a date.
Yeah.
Struck out. So I guess I'll do this thing.
Yeah,
this
so like
priest
there's this,
thing. Yeah.
so there's this common perception, which I don't think is true, although in some cases, in a particular cases, it might have been true, especially like in the 60s and 70s. But less so, I think, today in the modern society, especially since we've had the cleaning up of American seminaries. But there's this perception where like guys are avoiding relationship and fleeing into the priesthood. But we were taught in seminary that you are going into a relationship. You are diving into a relationship in the celibate relationship. It's with the collective church as a whole. You're not devoting yourself to one individual. You're devoting yourself to a whole group. You're devoting yourself to the bride, which is a composition of all the people of God. And like you're called to empty yourself out, give yourself entirely. Now, has that been taught to the people? Do people understand that? Maybe kind of in this vague sense.
Kind of hodgepodge here and there.
Yeah, hodgepodge. Yeah. But like there's this notion of like, are we explaining what the celibate vocation actually is? As well as like emptying ourselves out into that ourselves. Because like that's what we're called to as priests, is that we are called to be a stand-in for the bridegroom.
Right.
But is that being taught? But it also goes to this perception that people have is like, what type of guys are being attracted? Like, where do these problems exist? Like, is the pedophilia that we've seen in the last like 50, 60 years, is this a consequence of celibacy? Which I think that's a false narrative. I think it's a false question, because if you look at the other congregations, the other denominations, like married clerics, like you just have pretty much the same statistical number of people who struggle and who fall into sexual sins, as well as who have engaged in sexual abuse and things like that. There's not really, in terms of the data, at least that I've seen, there's not a difference in the amount of celibates versus married guys who are actually engaging in alternative activities.
Yeah, because lots of times guys go into marriage to hide too. That guys go into the priesthood to hide sometimes, and we know that was an issue at least in the 50s and 60s. Maybe it still is now. And they have, you have people in your congregation that will encourage a guy who's not lucky with women, or maybe he's super smart and those sorts of things, rather than, thinking to themselves, what kind of guy do I want to be a priest? Who would I want to be a priest? And looking at someone and saying, man, he'd be a good priest. He's the kind of guy I would like to follow. He's the kind of guy I think would give good advice, can relate to people, all those sorts of things. And instead what we do is we, sometimes take the guy who's the odd man out and we say, well, why don't you just go into the priesthood?
Go be a priest.
Yeah, just go be a priest.
I was super cool. I was so cool. Don't ask anyone from high school because they tell you the truth. But
but what happens, in marriage? You're right. I mean, that's not the way you talk about someone getting married. You don't say, oh man, I mean, you're not very good with girls. Well, go find that one girl that you'll be good with.
Right.
No. It's a calling to it. And people, I mean, if you're looking to marry someone, you're not looking for the one that's the odd person out, the one that doesn't fit. You're looking for someone who's going to relate to you, someone who's going to feed you, who's going to be, a strong partner for you, rather than just trying to find someone who's, okay, well, they don't have anybody, neither do I. Let's go find them. And lots of times in the church, that's what we do with these vocations. We're calling people to this stuff. And I think also, too, one thing that we don't teach enough or maybe is not recognized enough is that everyone has a vocation when it comes to whether you're single or married.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, everyone who's not married, it's not like they're not in a vocation because they're not married or they're not a priest. They're in a current vocation called single life.
Right.
And to understand that single life is a vocation and that to go from that, we need to be just as strong on whether we should be a priest or religious or not as we are into finding someone who, to be married or not. And so not allowing ourselves to say, well, single is just the kind of the reset mode, and that's where we just start from, but it's not a calling. I mean, it's a definite calling, and until we're called out of that, that's where we live. And the more that we can, thrive and survive in that, the more that we can bring that into the next part of our lives, whatever we're called to, or we live in that for the rest of our life.
I think we have a lot more about the single life that we could probably say, because I want to fight you on some of those points.
I have a couple of points too.
But I think every vocation, and this is maybe where it needs to go, and we can wrap up here in just a second. I want to hear kind of some closing arguments from each of us here about this. About specifically priests being called, being called by the church to celibacy, be invited, to live celibacy, but I think for all of us, we can all say that within this, as a married priest, as those that are living chaste celibacy, we recognize that we're sinners, that we're still called every day to basic chastity, which we haven't gotten into chastity. That could be a whole nother show. With chastity, which is living your sexuality with integrity, not giving into lust, those sins of lust that are all around us. That every single person's called to chastity. I remember back when I was doing chaplain for a high school. The guys on the football team were like, "Oh man, Father Michael, you can't have sex." And I was like,
neither can you.
Neither can you. Because you're called to chastity.
No, I can, but I choose not to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
just as you were called to choose not to.
So recognizing that we live in a society that's forgotten that basic, chastity, basic purity of heart, that integrity that we're called to, and we suffer because of it. And there's a lot more that could be said about that.
And the glory which is found in that.
Absolutely, and learning self-mastery. And we get to do it in the context of the priesthood, in the context of your marriage within the priesthood, for us as chaste celibates within the priesthood, that it is exciting, and it is an invitation that God has for us. So in closing here, I'd love to hear just kind of like a closing round out from each of you about just your thoughts on should Catholic priests get married?
I'll go first.
Let's start with him.
Yeah. I'll go first since I am the married one. So when I first, let people know that I wanted to be a priest in the Catholic Church, so I felt like I was being called to that. One of the reasons why I did that was because there was a need. I knew that there was a need there, and so I offered myself, and that's the way I've always put it. I've offered myself to the church, and if the church tells me no for whatever reason, whether it's I'm not called to it, or whether it doesn't need me, then I'm fine with that. But there was a sense of a need there, and it was something that was allowable for me because, of course, I was a Protestant beforehand and was an Anglican priest beforehand, and so it's allowable for me because I didn't grow up in the idea that priests were celibate, and so that's one of the thinkings of it. But the whole idea of calling to this, and I recognize the genius of the Catholic Church of celibacy and the reason that it's there and the purpose that it serves. And so I'm not here to wave the flag for married guys. I'm not here to say, oh, well, see, I'm a good reason why we should have married priests. As a matter of fact, my wife keeps a running list of why we shouldn't have married priests. Like, she's got a running list of, this is reason number 372 why a priest shouldn't be married. And so I'm not here to
We're
say
going to have
that.
her on next time, just reading the list. That's
There
going to
you
be,
go.
yeah.
That's it. Yeah, just ticking off the reasons. And so, I'm not here to wave the flag for that. I think that there's other issues that would be brought in with a married priesthood, in that not just to support the status quo, but that there's an actual reason why priests are celibate, and that it's a good reason, and it's good for the church. And so that we continue this practice is something that even as a married priest, I'm fully on board for and want to see.
Yeah, I'd go to kind of two of my sisters after she's told, because every time that they come into town, they stay with me in our spare room at the rectory. And two of my sisters have both told me on different occasions, were like, you would never be able to have a wife.
Yeah.
not just because it's me, right? Which actually they wouldn't agree. They've told me that I think you make a great husband. Yeah. They're like, but the life that you live right now, they're like, no self-respecting woman would put up with this schedule as well as with what you're doing, which is the difference between a marriage. Like, that's what I don't think people understand when they say married priests. People's expectations of their priests, especially if they're celibates, that would dramatically change. Mm-hmm. And our availability, if you got rid of the celibacy, which is not going to happen, but if you were to go, again, massively back to married clerics, like the people of God, I don't think the average Catholic recognizes how dramatically this would change actually their expectations and the consequence. It's not well thought out. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. Is like people they look at it as a quick fix to a complex situation, complex problems, of which we obviously been dealing with. But it's like having married clerics is not going to solve the questions and the problems that people actually want these solutions to. This is like a Band-Aid fix. So, and you'd also obviously lose, as we've been talking about, you'd lose the beauty of actually what celibacy is. We'll always have celibacy, but I think that there is a wisdom in the church which is promoting the celibate vocation, and which says that, you know what, the guys who are engaged in ministry as celibates, they are more free. They are able to devote themselves. And this has formed and fashioned the consciousness of the average Catholic in the last 1,000 years. Like, there would be a lot of trauma actually with people of all of a sudden, like, I call, and like, because for the married cleric, your first responsibility is to your family and second to the church. And that's where people, I think that it's kind of an immature solution, is that people are not with maturity looking at the actual problems. They just kind of have this quick fix. So even if Pope Francis were to theoretically allow all of us to get married tomorrow,
Uses Pope wand.
yeah, exactly. Like, I can't say, like, I think that in my early 20s, I might have thought, oh, maybe I'll get married. At this point, no, I love being a celibate. Like, it's not always easy, but neither is marriage always easy. Correct. So but I love being a celibate, and I don't think that I would get married because I chose in prayer, like, that's what the Lord presented to me in prayer one day. He's like, Tom, I'm offering to you both. You can be married or you can be a celibate. You can be a priest. He's like, you can't have both at this point. He's like, you have to choose. And I chose celibacy. I chose my vocation in the priesthood. And this was not me like saying no to something. It was me saying yes to something. And so, like, in that, I think that there's a balance, because the church, we do have married. It's rare. I mean, it's the exception. But as the ordinary, I'm not sure that I think that it would necessarily be the magic fix that people think it's going to be.
And you didn't even mention the financial aspect.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I mean, just how it would turn the local parish upside down. It would be a true change.
We're gonna have a full show with your finances actually after this as well. Along with your wife reading it. Well, I think for me, just in closing, guys, I'm so appreciative just of this conversation and for just being able to dive into this. Obviously, the struggles and problems and concerns that people have. But for myself, just my closing thought, I was struck when you said, Father Tom, just being chosen, that we've chose this call, but also it comes because Jesus has chosen us. And that's such an amazing gift and grace to be chosen by the God who loves us and who made us for the fullness of life. And I think it's also I just want to say a word of gratitude to all those who've been watching this episode of Catholic in America, and for liking and sharing and subscribing, supporting us on Patreon, all the things that you do to help us to be able to have these conversations and to bring it to as many people as possible. So on behalf of Father Doug and Father Tom and Father Michael Nixon, thanks so much for joining us on Catholic in America, and we'll see you next time.